Let's begin with the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. Until fairly recently, the majority of scholars understood Ezra and Nehemiah as the conclusion of the chronicler's history. Remember, we looked at the book of Chronicles last time in lecture 3, and this is a rewriting of the history primarily of Judah, the southern kingdom, through the eyes of the priest in a post-exilic environment. And so Ezra and Nehemiah really continue that historical narrative as the people return from the Babylonian exile into the land. And recent studies question this position, and you can read more about that in your textbook, Lessor, Hubbard, and Bush, page 558. But Ezra and Nehemiah are the traditional authors of the books that bear their names. And these books, we believe, are based primarily on their personal memoirs and are supplemented with court records from the Persian court, as well as records from the local government that was under the purview of the Persians, but was there in Judah. So the material was combined, most likely in at least a couple of stages of editing. First stage, of course, was writing the memoir itself, as Ezra and Nehemiah, or one of their followers, wrote down the events that had occurred. And then the second stage was the combining in of other materials from the exile, as well as the archive materials from the Persian court and the local government there in Judah. The setting of the book, of course, is the context is both Babylon and Judah, but primarily in Judah. Remember, the Assyrian Empire had conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, but the Assyrians eventually succumbed to the Babylonians, and Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, was sacked by the Babylonians in 612 BC. And that from that point, the Babylonians were in control and had influence over Palestine, even defeating the powerful Egyptian army at the Great Battle of Carchemish, 605 BC. And subsequently, of course, the Babylonians controlled the southern kingdom of Judah and eventually destroyed its capital city, Jerusalem, in 587, fall of 587, spring of 586. And then they themselves, the Babylonians, were succeeded by the Persians. So we have this movement from Assyrians to Babylonians and now to the Persian Empire. And the Persian Empire originated in the region that we know today as southern Iran. And the Persians became the overlords of the Jewish captives who were in exile there in Babylon. And it was Cyrus, a Persian king, not a Babylonian king, but Cyrus the first, a Persian king, who decreed that the Jews could return to their homeland in 538 BC. Now, there are several important Persian kings from this period, from this time frame, that you need to be aware of. And of course, Cyrus is the first. He reigned for about 20 years, from 550 to 530 BC. And he was the founder of the Persian Empire, and actually a fairly benevolent dictator, because his decree permitted the Jews to return to their homeland. In fact, Cyrus did this not just for the Jews, but for most of those peoples who had been held captive by the Babylonians. He allowed them to return to their homelands. The second great king of this period is Cyrus's successor, whose name was Cambyses. And he ruled for about 8 years, from 530 to 522 BC. And he conquered Egypt. Not only did were the Egyptians defeated by the Babylonians at the Battle of Carchemish, but the Persians extended the battle into Egyptian territory. And after Cambyses conquered Egypt, he dies rather mysteriously, either by murder or perhaps suicide. We're not sure. But he is succeeded by Darius the First, or perhaps sometimes the name is pronounced Darius, Darius or Darius. And he ruled from 522 to 486. And he solidified the unrest. You know, anytime there was a transition in the kings, it was a time of unrest. Who has control and who's going to be able to exert control? But Darius got things under control. And we have what's known as the Behistun inscription on a cliff. It's written in 3 languages, in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. And he exerted his authority in that inscription. And it really was the glory days for the Persian Empire under Darius. He was very organized, and he set up satrapies, which were provinces, essentially. That's the Persian word for a province or a region. And Judah was known as Aram Naharaim, the satrapy of Aram Naharaim, the land beyond the river. And Darius ruled over this really glory days of the Persian Empire. He is succeeded by Artaxerxes the First. And remember that name, not Xerxes the First, but Artaxerxes the First, who ruled from 465 to 424 BC. And this is the king associated with the book of Esther, Artaxerxes the First. And we believe that traditionally, both Ezra and Nehemiah lived during his reign. So if you remember none of the other names, of course, Cyrus, you got to remember Cyrus because he's the one who gave the decree releasing the Jews in 538. But remember Artaxerxes the First, because he is the king who stands in the background of both the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and the book of Esther. And he is the one who signed the peace of Callus in 449 with the Greeks. And remember the Battle of Thermopylae and all the great legends of the Persian invasions of Greece and so forth. And really, at that peace of Calais, he surrendered Asia Minor to the Greeks. He stayed in the area of Persia, but that was the limit of the Persian Empire. And really the beginning of the rise of the Greek Empire that, of course, would come to fullness under Alexander the Great in the 2nd century BC. But Artaxerxes the First, certainly a name you want to remember, at least for the quiz. Literary considerations for this book. All evidence supports that the books were really considered by the original scholars, the rabbis, and later the Masoretes in the 5th century AD, who edited the Hebrew text, to be one book. Ezra and Nehemiah are one continuous history. They read seamlessly, just like we read from 1 Samuel into 2 Samuel, 1 Kings into 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles into 2 Chronicles. So we read a flowing narrative from Ezra into Nehemiah, and they really were treated as a single work. Origen, who lived around 185 AD, was an early Christian writer and is one of the first who separated them into 2 books, the book of Ezra, the book of Nehemiah. So when Jerome, the great translator of the Latin Vulgate in the 4th century AD, translated the Greek text, really the Septuagint, into Latin to form the Latin Vulgate, Jerome applied the name Nehemiah to the second part of the book. So Ezra became associated with the first part of the book, and the name Nehemiah, the wall builder, became associated with the second part of the book through the influence of Jerome. Now, the first time the Hebrew text separates them into 2 books is not until 1448 in AD, 1448 AD. Amazing, 13th century AD, before the two books were separated. So we do find them as separate books in Hebrew Bible today, but originally they were considered to be one book. Of course, as with most biblical books, they contain a variety of literary forms. There are two primary types of literature within Ezra and Nehemiah, and one is narrative, sometimes almost autobiographical narrative in the context of Ezra and Nehemiah themselves. And then, of course, the court archives from the Persian court and from the province of Aram Naharaim, the court records of the province there in Judah. The narrative material is really two blocks, the memoirs of Ezra and the memoirs of Nehemiah. And for the most part, these are written in first person, so they are really autobiographical. And we can really only attribute them directly to each man who is named as the one saying those words. The archival material probably came again from the Persian court, the local governor's records, and perhaps some temple archives that had been preserved. And there are at least three different types of this archival material. There are official edicts and decrees by the Persian authorities. Of course, the greatest of these would be the decree by Cyrus releasing the Jews from captivity. There is some official correspondence between the Persian kings and local officials. This becomes important, certainly in the time of Nehemiah, as there are objections raised by local peoples to the wall building that he undertakes, and there's communication back and forth between the local court and the Persian court. And then there are lists of families. And this is perhaps one of the harder parts sometimes to read in these books, the names of the temple personnel, the utensils, and two extensive sections written in Aramaic, not in Hebrew, but in Aramaic. And of course, Aramaic is a form of Hebrew that has some grammatical, syntactical spelling changes, and additional words that have been added through the influence of the Babylonian language. As Israel was in captivity, she picked up words and ways of speaking and writing associated with her captors, and this is the origin really of Aramaic. And we have two great sections of Aramaic in Ezra. Ezra chapter 4, verse 7 through chapter 6, verse 18 is the first block. And then Ezra chapter 7, verse 12 through 26 is the second block of Aramaic. And these sections document some official edicts and correspondence between the king and the local government officials. So they communicated using the Aramaic language. Well, let me just give you a brief outline. The first 6 chapters of Ezra document the early return of the Jews from Babylon, now the Persian Empire, back to Judah, Aram Naharaim. And then the return and the reforms of Ezra, chapters 7 through 10 of Ezra, and also paralleled with Nehemiah chapters 8 through 10. And then the return and the reforms of Nehemiah, chapters 1 through 7 of Nehemiah, his return, and then the reforms in 11 through 13. So the two narratives are interwoven, definitely related. And this is a simple outline. Let me just talk a bit about some of the theological significance of Ezra and Nehemiah. As we've seen, God is a God of the covenant, and these books certainly focus on God returning or continuing, really, his role as one who is loyal to his covenant, and he is sovereign even over the great Persian Empire that defeated the enemy of the people, the Babylonians. And he is the God of the whole earth, not just of Judah, but of the whole earth. And he is the one who judges and delivers his people, the one who works really through historical process, almost miraculous, the fall of the Babylonian Empire, the city of Babylon, to the Persians almost without a fight. And then the miraculous decree of Cyrus freeing the Jews to return to their homeland after the time of captivity. Now, the people of the covenant, let me talk about that a bit. The returnees considered themselves to be the people of the covenant. They were the legitimate heirs of God's covenant promises. They were, as Isaiah had referred to them, the remnant of God's people, those who had gone through the time of chastisement and the time of exile, and now they were returning to take up the covenant promises. Also, you'll want to read closely in your textbook, LeSueur, Hubbard, and Bush. This early return is under this nebulous, never clearly understood character named Sheshbazzar. We talk a lot about the return under Ezra and the work of Nehemiah, and they are the central characters of these books. But the one that really comes first and that we know very little about is Sheshbazzar. He's mentioned in Ezra 5:14, and he's called their governor. So he had some political appointment from the Persian Empire to lead the people, and he is the one, according to Ezra 5:16, who laid the foundation of the temple. But of course, he would not be the one to complete it. It would be completed with the prodding of Haggai under the leadership of Zerubbabel, the Davidic heir, and Joshua the high priest later on. We read about that in the little book of Haggai, in the book of the 12, and we'll study that in Old Testament 3. But just know that Sheshbazzar was the original governor who led the people back to the land, and he's the one who laid the temple foundation stone. But we really don't have any other info about him. We don't even know his ancestry. And LeSueur, Hubbard, and Bush point that out, so you can read more about it there. But these people of the covenant considered themselves to be the legitimate heirs of God's promises. And there are three prominent realities that symbolize the life of the people of the covenant, that they have returned to the temple, that great Temple Mount in Jerusalem, the place where the presence of God had dwelt in the Holy of Holies above the Ark of the Covenant there, the temple that had been destroyed by the Babylonians. And that's why it was important when Sheshbazzar came back that he lay that temple foundation stone to reestablish the temple, the priesthood, and the sacrificial system, not perfectly at first, mostly coming later through the reforms of Ezra, but that intention to reestablish the temple. Then the reestablishment of the law, which was the guiding principle for God's people to live and remain and be well in the land. And certainly we associate the reestablishment of the law with Ezra, who was the great reformer, the editor, and the one who read the law to the people and encouraged them to abide by the regulations of God's law so that they could stay in the land and be fruitful in the land. And then the wall, which points to the possession, that the people were back in the land of promise, the land which God had promised to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants. And the wall symbolized solidifying their position back in the land. And Nehemiah is the one who builds the wall. So Sheshbazzar initiating the promise of the temple, Ezra reinitiating the importance of the law in guiding and governing God's people, and Nehemiah rebuilding the wall to solidify the possession of the land by God's people. So these three elements, temple, wall, and law, are at the center of the people of the covenant. Now, let's talk about the canonical importance of these books. The third quarter of the 5th century BC really saw a complete reorganization of the Jewish community. And according to John Bright, in his wonderful History of Israel, says this, that this period clarified its stature, saved it from disintegration, and set it on the path which it was to follow through the remainder of the biblical period, and with some modification until today. So Ezra and Nehemiah were the principal characters that were responsible for forging this new identity for the Jewish people centered around the temple and the law. And really, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah serve really as bridge books. And they're really the only biblical source material that we have for insight about this transition of how the Jews moved from old Israel into the emergent Judaism that we find in the New Testament. And so the foundations of the temple priesthood, the Jewish Sanhedrin, leadership more by the council of priests than the Davidic heir, the rise of the synagogue as an important place of worship apart from Jerusalem. All of these elements of Second Temple Judaism are coming to be here in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah and setting the stage for the Judaism that we have in place as Messiah Jesus comes on the scene. So it is a canonically important work. We don't want to overlook that by any means. And certainly we remember that God, is a God of history, that he is working out his story through history. There is nothing random or at chance. The fact that Cyrus conquers the Babylonians and makes this decree is a part of God's plan, that they come back under Sheshbazzar, the reforms of Ezra and Nehemiah. These are godly leaders who were called for a purpose to restore the law and the wall and to begin rebuilding the temple, to reestablish God's covenant people back in the land after the time of chastisement. All of these things were working together in history to continue the story of God with his people. Let me share a few observations about the text of Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra chapters 1 through 6, as I said, really cover the early years of the post-exilic community, from the decree of Cyrus in 538 down to about 516, which is around the time of the rise of the prophet Haggai and shortly thereafter Zechariah, and the leadership of Zerubbabel, who was the Davidic heir, and Joshua, who was the newly installed high priest of that period. The Edict of Cyrus is found in three places in the biblical text. It's recorded in 2 Chronicles 36, verses 21 and 22, as a part of the chronicler's history. Of course, it stands at the beginning of the book of Ezra because that is the beginning point for the return of God's people to the land. Ezra 1, verses 2 through 4 is a statement of it. And it's also in Ezra 6, verses 3 through 5. Cyrus had been called a shepherd of God's people by the prophet Isaiah, Isaiah 44:28. And also in Isaiah 45:1, he's referred to as Yahweh's anointed. And again, this emphasizes that God was looking toward the return of his people to their homeland, even in the ministry of the prophet Isaiah there in his book of comfort, chapters 40 to 55, where he pronounces that the time of punishment is past and a time of comfort is coming for his people as they return to the land. And Zerubbabel, again, was the governor who is remembered with fondness, but Ezra 3 through 7 records the completion of the temple after a few years of delay and disappointment. And it was rededicated, or really dedicated. The second temple was dedicated. The temple of Zerubbabel, that would later be grandized and become Herod's temple, was dedicated in March of 515 BC. So that's really what is going on as the Jews return, this early history in chapters 1 through 6. And then come reforms. And you really need to read Ezra 7 through 10 and Nehemiah 8 through 10 in parallel, because they document the reforms that took place in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, Ezra is a short name for Azariah. My legal name is William, but my short name is Bill. And so The Hebrews, of course, just as most peoples do that, they have a long name and they have a short name. And Ezra's long name was Azariah, which literally means Yahweh has helped. Yahweh has helped. And certainly Ezra was Yahweh's helper. He was helped by Yahweh, and he helped the people with the reforms of Yahweh. But the short form of his name is the one that we know best, is Ezra. And perhaps he was a scribe in the Persian court there in Babylon. It's certain that he was a priestly figure because he claimed Aaron as one of his ancestors, Aaron, the great high priest. And as a scribe and a priest, he was rather uniquely situated to fill this transitional role as Judah moves from an Old Testament priesthood into a New Testament scribal system. So this is the rise of, through Ezra, the rise of the scribes and the Pharisees, the leaders who would be in control in the time of Jesus. Ezra led a group back to Judah, a second wave of returnees, if you will. Sheshbazzar had led the first, but he kind of fades from the picture. We don't know any more about him, but we know more about Ezra, who leads back a group after having been commissioned by the Persian king there in Ezra 7:11 through 26. And he goes back really to bring stability to the region and to restore the worship of Yahweh within the Jewish cult. His most important tasks really were to deliver materials and gifts to the temple priests so that they could function, to appoint judges to adjudicate disputes among the people and to lead the people in the ways of God, and then certainly to teach the law. That's what we think of perhaps the most with Ezra, is that he is the great teacher of the law, going back and reading Torah to the people and encouraging them to take action, to live in accord with what was written in God's law. Ezra either was an official of the Persian court, or he was a religious secretary of state. He had some special standing with the court and certainly was recognized as an unofficial leader of the community, although he wasn't really classified as governor like Sheshbazzar had been. He had power and authority because he had been sent by the Persian king. And really from an external political point of view, he failed to accomplish, everything that he desired to accomplish. But he did accomplish perhaps the thing that was most important to him, which was rebuilding the tradition around the law. And in that, he was brilliantly successful. He did reinstitute a hearing and an obedience to the law that had fallen into disrepair even during the period of the exile. The first century Jewish Roman historian Josephus praised Ezra really as the principal priest, who was the one most skilled in knowing, interpreting, and enforcing the law of Moses. And he related in his historical narratives that Ezra lived in Jerusalem and at an advanced age died and was buried there. The Talmud, the Jewish Talmud, contains numerous references to Ezra and credits him with reestablishing the law. Although he's not mentioned in the New Testament, the early church fathers believed that he could repeat orally the entire Old Testament. And scripture memorization is something that we have pretty much lost in our society today. But the ancient peoples would memorize entire passages, entire books, and in some cases, the entire Hebrew Bible. And this is common among Muslim peoples today. The imams will memorize great portions of scripture and sometimes the whole of the Quran. But Ezra is believed to have been able to recite the entire Old Testament from memory. or the Hebrew Bible. We call it the Old Testament, but we know we're talking about the Hebrew Bible. One of the most significant crises that Ezra and Nehemiah faced was this situation of mixed marriages. And that's addressed in chapters 9 and 10 of Ezra and chapter 13 of Nehemiah. And the language here points to religiously mixed marriages rather than ethnically mixed. So the Jews had intermarried with people who worshiped other gods, and this was a problem. This had been the problem that had led to the people's downfall in the period of the Judges, and later, certainly in Israel in the north, as Jezebel comes to be the wife of Ahab and brings the worship of Baal or Baal with her. And so again, the people are intermarrying with those of other faiths and are falling away from worship of Yahweh. And this was the motivation for the reforms of Ezra and Nehemiah. And we talked about this a bit in our study of the book of Ruth, that some scholars who date the writing, or at least the last redaction of Ruth, to the 5th century BC, see it as contra literature, that there were some Jews who were married to women who were faithful to Yahweh. And they said, why must we send away our foreign wives if they're followers of Yahweh like us? And like the great Moabitess Ruth, who is the great grandmother of King David, why should we send away foreign wives just because they're foreign if they're worshipers of Yahweh? And certainly we've looked at that issue in the book of Ruth. But the language in Ezra really is pointing to those religiously mixed marriages where the wives were not faithful followers of Yahweh. The major unresolved issue with Ezra really is the date that he returned from Babylon. The traditional date is 458 BC, which is the 7th year of Artaxerxes. And you can look in Ezra 7:1 and verses 7 and 8 for references that support that. But modern scholars have really questioned that chronology. And they have proposed a date really as late as 398 BC, which is the 7th year of Artaxerxes II. Okay, the name Artaxerxes I or Artaxerxes II. And some have even amended the text to say not the 7th year, but the 37th year, which would move the date of his return to 428 BC. So it's hard to know exactly what date he returned. Many commentators, if you read commentaries on Ezra and Nehemiah, will find some problems in the biblical order and are really unwilling to replace it with something equally uncertain or at least less certain. So the date of the return of Ezra and certainly of Nehemiah are really up in the air. We're not sure exactly the dates. We know it was around the 5th into the 4th century BC, but sometimes it's hard to put a historical absolute on the date of their return. Now, the return and reforms of Nehemiah are covered in chapters 1 to 7 of Nehemiah, and then in chapters 11 to 13. And his name means Yahweh has comforted. Nehemiah, if you will, the prophet Nahum, whose name means comfort, and Ayah, of course, referring to Yahweh. So Yahweh has comforted. And that's certainly a great name, especially in light of the prophecies of Isaiah's book of comfort, that God's time of punishment for his people is past and their return to the land is ahead. And so Nehemiah is a part of that, as God's comforted him and through him comforts his people and reestablishes their presence by the rebuilding of a wall around Jerusalem. Nehemiah was a member of the Persian court. He was cupbearer to the king. And this was a very important position. He was basically the wine taster. If there was poison in the wine, it was going to get Nehemiah before it got the Persian king. And so he had a very important, very responsible job and a high degree of trust because it went from his lips to the king's lips. He was concerned about his people back in the homeland. Like Ezra, he was commissioned by his request He was commissioned by the Persian king to carry out a specific task, and his major assignment was to provide physical security for Jerusalem, to rebuild the wall that the Babylonians had torn down. And so he led that effort of rebuilding the wall and of repopulating the city. Once it had a wall, then it was a safe, secure location, and people once again wanted to live within the safety of its walls. And he essentially served 2 terms as governor of Judah, of the satrap of Aram Naharaim. In addition, he helped reinforce and carry out the social and religious forms along with Ezra. They worked conjointly, and they really transformed this small band of returnees into a strongly bonded religious community, safe and secure behind the wall there in Jerusalem. Now, the date of Nehemiah is established in the biblical text in combination with the Elephantine papyri, which the Elephantine papyri are documents of a Jewish enclave living in the city of Elephantine in southern Egypt. And there are letters there dated to 408 BC that speak of an older Sanballat as the governor of Samaria. And this Sanballat is perhaps the one, or at least a relative of one of Nehemiah's persecutors, who questioned his work and sent to the Persian court to find out if what Nehemiah was doing was really authorized or not. And so if this Sanballat, governor of Samaria, is the one who confronted Nehemiah in the wall building, this would put Nehemiah's time in the land around the mid-5th century BC, somewhere during the reign of Artaxerxes I. As I said at the beginning, we associate Artaxerxes I with both Ezra and Nehemiah's work in the land. And Nehemiah's first term as governor may have begun in 445 BC. And so his 2 terms could have taken him down, to 432 BC or even later. So there is some question whether Ezra returned before Nehemiah or Nehemiah before Ezra. We don't even know exactly which order they came back, but we do know that they worked together because of the parallels in their reforms between the 2 books.